Sergey Viktorovich, good afternoon. We're ready to start. Do you hear us? Do you see us?
And I see, and I hear, and I even feel you.
Great. All right. Then we'll probably start with the questions right away. Please, Russia 24. Sergey Viktorovich, good afternoon. The fact that Moscow and Washington announced their intention to conduct a nuclear test almost at the same time speaks more about undermining stability on the world stage, or, on the contrary, it is a demonstration of equal opportunities, which means maintaining this kind of parity.
Frankly speaking, I have not heard of Moscow announcing nuclear tests and saying that Washington and Moscow did it at the same time. But it is probably not very correct. Until now, as I had the opportunity to mention in a recent interview with the Russian media, we have not yet received explanations from our American colleagues that President Trump still had in mind nuclear or carrier tests, or so-called subcritical tests that are not associated with a nuclear reaction, which are allowed. There is no answer yet on the draft treaty, or rather on the Mutual Nuclear Test Ban Treaty.
Проекту договора, вернее, по договору о взаимном запрещении ядерных испытаний, ответа пока нет.
Just yesterday, there was a regular meeting of the Preparatory Commission for the Mutual Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and the representative of the United States did not give an answer at it either. Although it would seem that God himself ordered, as they say in such a forum, to clarify what the President of the United States meant. And do you know what else I noticed? The administration is still being formed in the United States. Many second-level, third-level positions, and, above all, in the Pentagon are being filled, and in particular, Mr. Robert Kadlec has been nominated for the post of Assistant Secretary of War. So now the head of the Pentagon is called Nuclear Deterrence for Chemical and Biological Protection Programs. And here he spoke in Congress a few days ago, in my opinion, last week. And he was, of course, tortured on the topic of nuclear tests, the approach of the current administration to nuclear weapons. He said that Trump's decision, I quote, to resume nuclear tests was dictated by geopolitical considerations. Considerations. There is still no technical need for them. This is a very strong statement. I do not know how much the author himself, whom I have just quoted, is aware of the seriousness of what has been said. But we must take it, obviously, in the sense that, as we said, there is no need for a technical nature in such tests. Then he has already completed this idea for us, that the goal turns out to be geopolitical. And what could be a geopolitical goal for the United States to dominate? And if the factor of nuclear weapons is used for this, but it is alarming, it is a significant departure from the concept that Reagan and Gorbachev approved, that a nuclear war cannot be won, therefore it should never be unleashed. Well, the same Kadlec, here is Mr. Kadlec, who is running for the post of Assistant Minister of War, said that it is necessary to develop nuclear options for responding to some potential regional conflicts. This is also an interesting statement. In other words, it is already a direct indication that this gentleman will reflect on the post of Assistant Secretary of War, in the spirit of threats of the use of nuclear weapons, in order to achieve solutions that the United States needs in a particular region. And he also demonstrated many more miracles of double standards when he said that NATO's nuclear deterrence strategy could be changed, due to the fact that Russian tactical nuclear weapons are deployed in Belarus. And the fact that this was done after many decades of the so-called joint nuclear missions, when the nuclear weapons of the United States, tactical nuclear weapons of the United States, were deployed a long time ago, in 5 NATO member countries. and that we have been talking about this for a long time. We propose to remove all nuclear weapons on the territory of the countries to which they belong. And all this was ignored. Now Belarus has received nuclear weapons from Russia, but then we will place them somewhere else. We know that there are relevant contacts with South Korea and Japan. This is well known, and it is a very dangerous game. Therefore, returning to the question, we have not announced that we are conducting nuclear tests. At a well-known meeting of the permanent members of the Security Council, the President drew attention to the statement of President Trump, who said that Russia has been doing this for a long time. China has been doing it for a long time, so we should do it too. And, as you know, we immediately turned to our colleagues, explained to them that there must be some kind of misunderstanding here. But we are waiting for clarification, that what the President received was not to conduct nuclear tests or even prepare for nuclear tests. The Foreign Ministry and our other departments, the military and special services, were instructed to analyze the situation and come to a common opinion on how much this situation requires consideration of the issue of resuming nuclear tests. And our principled position was set out by Vladimir Putin 2 years ago, in 2023, when he, answering the relevant question during one of his speeches, said that if one of the nuclear powers conducts nuclear weapons tests, not carriers, not under critical tests, but tests of nuclear weapons, then Russia will do the same.
Please, next question, Artie.
Mr. Minister, another article was recently published where the author and his, well, allegedly sources claim that the United States and Mark Rubio were shocked by your uncompromising attitude. Were you really strict with the Americans, or is this another article where you moved with sources? Well, you know, we are basically polite people, and we try to preserve this trait of our qualities. I have already had the opportunity to answer such questions in a number of interviews. And, given the professional audience of journalists, I would like to draw attention to the next facts of unprofessional, and, I would say, malicious coverage of some events with the media, in including, perhaps, primarily British.
Я бы сказал, в общем-то, вредоносного освещения некоторых событий средствами массовой информации, вот в том числе, может быть, прежде всего британскими.
What is happening now with the BBC is well known. The fact that some figures are trying to justify what happened and talk about some kind of staged company is a shame. And I would like to draw attention to the publication of the Financial Times, which wrote some time ago that Trump and Putin agreed to meet in Budapest, instructed Lavrov and Rubio to prepare a meeting. Lavrov and Rubio talked on the phone, and before that, the Russians sent a tough memorandum, upon receipt of which the Americans decided that it was useless and pointless to talk to us. There are a lot of lies here, including from the point of view of the sequence of events. The memorandum mentioned by the Financial Times journalists is a non-paper so-called not paper. This is a completely unofficial sketch that was sent to our colleagues not after Putin's conversation with Trump, but a few days before this conversation. And the purpose of this memorandum was to remind our American colleagues what the Vankarigi talked about, and what understandings, at least it seemed to us, and the Americans did not refute it, were achieved there during the meeting of the presidents of Russia and the United States of America. This informal document did not contain anything other than what was discussed in Anchorage, and did not cause rejection from the American interlocutors. the presidents had a telephone conversation after this material was handed over to the State Department and the National Security Council. And during the conversation on the phone, President Trump did not say a word about the fact that you threw us some kind of provocative, subversive paper. It destroys everything, all hopes for a settlement. Absolutely not. They talked normally. And President Putin responded positively to President Trump's proposal to meet in Budapest, and suggested instructing the foreign ministries to prepare this meeting. That's what we plan to do. President Trump said that Marco Rubio will call me back, or maybe he's already calling you now, Lavrov. He called 3 days later. We talked well politely, without any disruptions, confirmed in principle the movement, based on the understanding of Anchorage, and parted on that. And the next step should have been a meeting of representatives of the foreign policy, military, as I understand it, departments. Well, probably special services, but there was no such further step from the Americans, namely from them. We were waiting for an initiative on a specific place and time for such a preparatory meeting, since they made a proposal to prepare a summit, but instead a public statement that there is no point in dating. By the way, Marco Rubio, when he publicly commented on the phone conversation with him, he did not say that he noticed some kind of aggravation, that this aggravation undermines the chances. Not at all. Look at the quote. If I remember correctly, he said that it was a constructive conversation, and it showed quite clearly where we are. So it's not necessary to meet. Well, it can be interpreted in different ways, but it was said exactly that, so you know, as they say, there is such a joke. Our conscience is clear, we rarely use it, but in this particular case, it is absolutely true. We have no reason to make excuses for the fact that we were and remain committed to what the president said. And by and large, but if we did not agree on every point and comma, but reached an understanding in Alaska.
Please, the next question of the news. Good afternoon, Sergey Viktorovich. Well, you just said about the meeting in Budapest, following the results of Viktor Orban's talks in the United States. He said that he still hopes that this meeting will take place. Is there still this chance? And how did it happen that we are talking about nuclear tests? And before that we talked about the meeting in Hungary. What has changed?
But I think I've already answered. I cannot say what is behind the position of the United States on nuclear tests, because what President Trump said about the allegedly resumed tests in Russia, in China, is not true. If we are talking about nuclear tests, nuclear weapons tests, and critical tests, without a nuclear chain reaction and carrier tests, they have never been banned by anyone. So we are trying to clarify this. And if we talk about the facts, the last time we experienced it was in the 91st year, Americans in the 93rd. It was more than 30 years. China did not make its last test much later. The most recent test of nuclear weapons was the test by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the 2017 year, and since then, there have been no signs that anyone is preparing to resume this practice. Well, there has not been observed. To say that this is being done secretly deep underground, well, professionals who deal with this issue should still inform the White House, and not sit somewhere in their cubicles. There is a system, a global monitoring system. Russia participates in this system. The United States participates in this system. It is based on seismic data and records any more or less significant fluctuations in the soil. And they have long known what kind of signal means the use of a nuclear explosive device. That's why I would not mix this topic of nuclear tests and the topic of the Budapest summit. I watched yesterday, in my opinion, President Trump hosted someone in the White House or talked to journalists, and when he was asked, and together with Viktor Orban when asked about a meeting in Budapest, he said, "But I decided not to hold this meeting yet, because we will not agree on anything, but this is in the spirit and in line with his logic, which he recently indicated, that sometimes it is necessary to let the warring countries fight." So I sincerely don't see the connection here. We are also ready to discuss the suspicions that our American colleagues have that we have secretly dug something deep underground and are doing something there, and we are also ready to discuss with our American colleagues the resumption of preparatory work for the summit of the leaders of Russia and the United States proposed by them, if and when the American colleagues will renew their proposal, and will be ready to start preparing for the summit so that it really ends effectively, of course. Budapest will be the preferred place for us, especially since Donald Trump confirmed Budapest's preference for Washington at the meeting with Viktor Orban.
Конечно, Будапешт для нас будет предпочтительным местом, тем более, что Дональд Трамп на встрече с Виктором Орбаном подтвердил предпочтительность Будапешта и для Вашингтона.
Please, TASS. Good afternoon, Sergey Viktorovich. There is not much time left before the start deadline, and the United States has not presented an official position on Putin's initiative. Do you think we can expect a response from the United States in the near future? And if it suddenly turns out that there is no clear answer, what does this change for Russia? Thank you.
We have already said repeatedly that this proposal is our one-sided kind expression of goodwill. And in order for the United States to support our approach, no negotiations, no consultations are needed. We just need the United States to say, okay, and we will not. We will not increase the quantitative levels of the Strategic Offensive Arms Treaty within a year. At least for now, Russia adheres to this unilateral commitment. That's it. No other actions are needed here. As for whether negotiations are underway to extend it, no. I say again that the situation here is absolutely transparent. Here is the quantitative level, they are well known. And we know what the Americans have. Americans know what they have. Let's take a year or two. But if you want to cool down, analyze the situation, stop measuring everything through the Ukrainian Arsenal, and look at the responsibility of the great powers for global security, global stability. First of all, from the point of view of preventing nuclear war. We are ready for this. This has nothing to do with the fact that deadlines are tight. Because it is possible to announce that quantitative restrictions are being extended at any time until the 5th of February. By the way, when the current DNV was extended immediately after Biden took office. This was done a few days before the original deadline expired, and extending the contract itself is much more difficult than just voluntarily saying that I will comply and respect the quantitative parameters.
Please, RIA Novosti. Thank you very much, Sergey Viktorovich. Has Venezuela addressed Russia with a request for military assistance against the background of the aggravation of the situation in the region? And, if one more clarification is possible, has there been a request from Caracas for the deployment of Russian weapons on their territory, by analogy with Belarus?
Thank you. No, there were no such appeals to us. I think it is incorrect to compare our relations with Belarus, which is part of the Union state, with which we have synchronous, coordinated common positions on all key issues of international security, on the one hand, and our relations with Venezuela, which is a friendly country, a strategic comprehensive partner, about which we recently signed a corresponding agreement, but of course, taking into account the geographical factor. Including, and not least, it is incorrect to compare it with the union that we have with the Republic of Belarus.
Это некорректно сравнивать с тем союзом, который у нас есть с Республикой Беларусь.
In the contract I mentioned, this is a completely new contract. It was signed in May during the participation of President Nicolas Maduro in the events on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War in Moscow. And now it is at the final stage of ratification. They say it's called the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty. It speaks of the need to continue our cooperation in the field of security, including in the field of military technical cooperation. We are ready to fully act within the framework of the obligations that we have fixed in this agreement on a mutual basis with our Venezuelan friends. It has not yet entered into force. By the way, the ratification procedures have been completed in Venezuela. We have just a few days left. Both chambers of the State Duma and the Federation Council have already held the necessary hearings. So he is literally on his way out. And we will, as I have already said, be strictly guided by the obligations that are enshrined in it. But I cannot finish my comments on Venezuela without mentioning our position on the unacceptability of the actions that the United States is taking under the pretext of combating drug trafficking, destroying without trial. And even not only without trial and investigation, without presenting any facts to anyone, destroying boats, as they claim, transporting drugs. So, in general, it is not law-abiding countries that act, but those who consider themselves above the law. And if it comes to that, there were reports here quite recently about how much I can't remember which media outlet now, but Commerçant wrote about it, referring to some Western media, that Belgium is rapidly turning into a drug state where bribes and blackmail flourish in all spheres from customs to the police, violence. A shadow economy based on drug trafficking. All of this, of course, suggests that. Yes, I remembered, the Commerçant referred to the Daily Mail of oil as a source, but if they wrote about it, then they probably had no reason to build some kind of nonsense on NATO partners. So what should Nigeria and Venezuela do in terms of destroying drugs there, and at the same time seizing oil fields? It would probably be more convenient for the United States to eradicate this phenomenon in Belgium. Moreover, there are already American troops and other NATO troops there. There will be no need to chase some boats with 3 people in each. I am sure that this line, which the Trump administration has now chosen with regard to Venezuela, will not lead to anything good, and it will not increase Washington's reputation in the eyes of the world community.
Please, Komsomolskaya Pravda.
Sergey Viktorovich, you have repeatedly said that peace in Ukraine will be achieved only if the root causes of the conflict are eliminated. And as you know, one of the root causes of this conflict is neo-Nazism rampant in Ukraine. Are you discussing this problem, this topic, during negotiations with your American colleagues? Thank you. We regularly designate this topic, but it's true that after Anchorage and my telephone conversation with Marco Rubio, we had no contacts and we did not start a conversation specifically on this topic in Alaska. but they know our position perfectly well. They have, as I have already said, our position on paper. It is no secret. It was voiced by President Putin in June of the 24th year when he spoke at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, outlining our principled approaches to Ukraine and relations with the West. And among other absolutely indispensable conditions of regulation, such as demilitarization, the removal of any threats to the Russian Federation, including by dragging Ukraine into NATO, ensuring the rights of Russians and Russian speakers, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. There are also denazification requirements. And it's not that we have invented any such thing that would be alien in modern Europe. It would seem that there is the Nuremberg process, there are its results, which are part of the UNCharter, part of the foundation of the international system that was created after the Second World War. And, of course, the whole of Europe has subscribed to this. The process of denazification was carried out in Germany at one time, repentance. Unfortunately, now, including, and maybe even starting with Germany, we feel that these repentances are worth little. By the way, I talked about this at the time about 15 years ago, at the best of times, communicating with our German colleagues. We noticed that they were not sending signals verbatim in the form in which I am going to say about it now. But the meaning was very clear. Dear colleagues, we have paid off everyone for the Second World War. We don't owe anyone anything anymore. And now we will behave based on these assessments. And recently, Chancellor Merkel, Chancellor Scholz, they somehow tried to keep up appearances, and Merz has repeatedly stated that his goal is to make Germany the main military force in Europe again. I think there is no need to explain what kind of signal is being sent with such statements to make Germany the main military force again. It was already a military force when it conquered more than half of Europe and put the entire half of Europe under arms in order to attack the Soviet Union. And when such Nazi relapses occur in the country of the birthplace of Nazism, of course it causes alarm. Of course it will require us, from all those who are interested in a stable world, to be principled when the final parameters of the settlement are discussed. If the West realizes the hopelessness of such a scenario, that it is necessary not to demand a cessation of hostilities, in order to continue pumping Ukraine with weapons, but still to do as President Trump suggested in his time before Alaska, when he said that a temporary truce would not solve anything, that it is necessary to end the conflict on the basis of the principles of a sustainable settlement. Then Europe tried, and not unsuccessfully, to drag our American colleagues back to their camp with a truce. Support for Ukraine not a step back, not an inch to the left. But nevertheless, President Trump said it, and this, in general, became the basis of those understandings that were unequivocally agreed upon in Anchorage. By the way, this is the difference between the Republican administration, the Donald Trump administration, and its predecessor, the Biden administration. Here, too, recently I caught sight of an interview with Kurt Walker, who was a representative in the United States for Ukraine under Biden. And he said that Russia would never agree to a peace agreement. Where he got it from is unclear, because it is we who are seeking a peace agreement. He continued, Putin does not consider Ukraine a legitimate and sovereign state. There is an answer to that too. We recognized Ukraine, which was not Nazi, which did not prohibit any language, in this case the Russian language, from all countries of the world. And we recognized Ukraine, which, in accordance with the Declaration of Independence, was a nuclear-free, non-aligned neutral state. That's what we recognized and how it all looked like. But Kurt Volker goes on to say that Putin is convinced that Ukraine should be part of Russia. Well, I'm not even going to talk about it. And Putin also considers Zelensky a Nazi. Well, yes. And where is the evidence to the contrary? When Zelensky regularly poses on TV screens, presenting awards to the fighters of Azov and other Nazi battalions, with the ciphers of Nazi Germany on their sleeves. But how else to treat this person? Therefore, Nazism is immutable. I mean the destruction of Nazism in Ukraine, denazification. These are the immutable conditions of the settlement, which, if we want it to be long-term, and this is what we want, and we will achieve it. But when no one in the European space, communicating with Ukraine, raises issues related to the nationalization of the country, when no one touches on the topic, with the exception of Hungary, the topic of national minorities, when no one demands Zelensky to repeal the law prohibiting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical church,
когда никто не требует от Зеленского отменить закон, запрещающий украинскую православную церковь, каноническую церковь.
By the way, in Alaska, when President Putin was talking about how we assess the situation in Ukraine to Donald Trump, and when he mentioned that they passed a law last year that aims to ban the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, President Trump didn't believe it. He asked Mark Rubio, who was present at this conversation, 3 times. Is that so? Is it true? Mark confirmed that this is true. And it was obvious how the President of the United States was just discouraged, to put it mildly. And, of course, returning to Ukraine, to its legislation, Hungary, I mentioned Hungary. When the Brussels bureaucrats headed by Ursula von der Leyen, who is now creating some kind of intelligence structure there, will lead this structure herself. So when they pushed through the beginning of the decision to start negotiations with Ukraine on Kiev's accession to the European Union, Hungary alone must pay tribute to the courage of Viktor Orban and his foreign minister. My colleague Petr Siarda alone insisted that among the conditions that Ukraine must fulfill before negotiations begin, it was indicated the resumption and restoration of all Ukrainian obligations in the field of respect for the rights of national minorities. There is quite a large text on this topic. It was not difficult to come up with it, because the Constitution of Ukraine still requires respect for the rights of Russian and other national minorities. So when there is some commissioner there now, Lady Cause, in my opinion, on the enlargement of the European Union, when she says that Ukraine is ready, she has done everything in order to start negotiations. This is not true. Nothing has been done to satisfy the rights of national minorities, to restore these rights. Even for the Hungarian minority, although Hungary seems to be a member of the European Union, where Ukraine is rushing, and a NATO member somewhere, Zelensky is also constantly rushing. No, nothing is being done for this, just as nothing is being done with respect to the remains of the victims of the Volyn massacre. In relation to Poland, But when the European Union is generally silent on this topic, on the topic of blatant violations, the only country that has banned the language entirely, even, in my opinion. In Norway, 7% of the population of ethnic Swedes, Swedish is the official language. The figure is probably clear to you. You compare it with what it looks like in Ukraine. But with regard to Ukraine's actions, we do not hear anything from Brussels, except that we must be with Ukraine until the last, until victory. Again, this mantra was recently reproduced by mouths, other representatives of the Western European community should always protect Ukraine because it defends European values. But this is a confession, this is self-exposure. European values, therefore, in the understanding of the current Brussels bureaucracy, is the revival of Nazism. Therefore, we cannot show slack here.
Please, Rossiyskaya Gazeta.
Sergey Lavrov recently, the Lithuanian authorities, under far-fetched pretexts, are increasingly flirting with the topic of closing borders and stopping transit to Kaliningrad for Russians. What measures are being taken to prevent this, perhaps jointly with Minsk? And how will Russia respond to Lithuania if it does take this step? Yes, well, these small countries are young Europeans. They are, of course, Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, to a certain extent. They certainly greatly overestimate their importance for Western Europeans, for old-timers of the European Union. Well, those who in Europe retain common sense and really care about the security of the continent, although there are fewer and fewer of them. They are well aware of the provocative role assigned to these Baltic countries, first of all by their British curators. This is also well known, and London's role in provoking various situations, including the recent case, when the FSB exposed a plot aimed at forcing one of the Russian pilots to fly fighter jets with a Dagger missile, allegedly at the invitation of Constanța military base in Romania, with the explicit purpose of organizing the downing of this aircraft, accusing Russia of attacking the North Atlantic Alliance.
С явной целью организовать там сбитие этого самолета, обвинив Россию в нападении на Североатлантический альянс.
But we leave that aside. The FSB has exposed all this in great detail here, and I do not know how the British will wash themselves of this. Although their ability to be in the position of a goose that has come out of the shower is well known.
Быть в положении гуся, вышедшего из-под душа, она хорошо известна.
You see, there was an empire that ruled almost the whole world. Now this empire no longer exists. There is no such good old England to which they are accustomed to boast. And they have no economic strength left, and their military power is also relatively weak, including their nuclear arsenal, which they, in fact, cannot dispose of 100% themselves. But here it is necessary to compensate somehow. Compensates with this traditional English desire to divide and rule everywhere, well, speaking decently. And there are also indecent ways to designate how they behave and what goals they pursue at the same time. But returning to your question, Lithuania really, they have recently, in addition to the constant threats, to block the Kaliningrad transit. Some figures are no longer in Lithuania, but in the European Union, goading the Balts. They say that Kaliningrad can be leveled to the ground. And now Lithuania has blocked the border with Belarus. Moreover, it blocked the border, preserving hundreds of trucks belonging to Lithuanian carriers on the territory of the neighboring Republic of Belarus. Alexander Grigoryevich Lukashenko, as always, spoke figuratively about this. This is an outrageous action, and no one in the European Union Excuse me, but the Americans have repeatedly expressed this in relation to dictators in Latin America, in Central America. Yes, this dictator is a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch. This is the same attitude of the European owners of the Balts to their tricks. They are assigned the role of doing as many heinous things as possible in relations with the Russian Federation, and at the same time, provoking Russia to actions that will then try to sell to Washington, first of all, as a basis for launching serious hostilities on the basis of the 5th article of the Washington NATO Treaty. We see it. But the Kaliningrad transit obligations are not only Lithuania's obligations, they are the obligations of the European Union. Back in 1990, when the Partnership Agreement on Cooperation between Russia and the EU was signed, it contained a provision on the need to ensure transit through each other's territory, given that we are neighboring countries. Then, in the 2002 year, a separate transit agreement was signed. It wasn't an agreement, in my opinion, a joint statement, but it had the effect of direct action. And in 2000, when the Baltic states, along with a number of other Eastern European countries, were admitted to the EU, a statement was signed on the enlargement of the European Union and on the principles of partnership between the European Union and the Russian Federation. It's all fixed there. After that, technical documents were adopted, including documents that describe the appearance and powers, if you like, of the so-called temporary travel document. All this was painted down to the details, to the smallest detail. How citizens' travel and cargo delivery are controlled on trains. It was all spelled out. Therefore, the European Union should think about what responsibility it has for the behavior of its own out-of-control guys. By the way, I remember when the decisions on admission to the European Union of Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia were being prepared in the 2004 year, we spoke to our European interlocutors. Then we had a lot of contacts and quite confidential conversations. Are they sure that these three Baltic countries are ripe to meet the criteria for membership in the European Union? We were told, well, of course, somewhere they are not up to it. Does it make sense to drag such unprepared applicants into the EU right away? We were told, you know, we understand what you are talking about. After gaining independence, they still retained all sorts of phobias. They remember what kind of occupied position they were in, and they have these phobias that won't go away. But we will accept them into the European Union and NATO. And they will calm down. Calm down, it seems to me, quite the opposite. Not only did they not calm down, they decided that they would now order music from both the European Union and NATO, at least as far as openly Russophobic anti-Russian rhapsodies are concerned. And that's where they stand now. Therefore, you know, if, in response to what I am setting out now, the European Union says to us, yes, we have agreed something there, but you yourself invaded Ukraine. I have no doubt that there will be those who want to, but if they do not want, to remember how everything developed with Ukraine. How it all began long before the Minsk agreements, when they were looking for long before Crimea, when in the 2013 year. By the way, when President Yanukovych at that time suddenly analyzed the prospects for signing an association agreement. Or there he talked about the associated partnership with the European Union, and realized that many of its provisions would jeopardize trade. The trade regime and other benefits that Ukraine had in economic contacts with the Russian Federation.
И понял, что многие его положения поставят под угрозу торговлю, торговый режим и прочие льготы, которые Украина имела в экономических контактах с Российской Федерацией.
When
Когда
he
он это
realized
понял и
this and
стал
began to
просить
ask to postpone the
отложить
signing of the EU-Ukraine
подписание
agreement,
соглашения
scheduled
Украины
then,
и ЕС,
finally, on November 2000 of the
намеченного
13th
тогда на
year.
конец ноября 2013 года,
And when we
когда
supported his
мы
approach, it was
поддержали
not because we
такой
did
его
not
подход,
want,
не потому что
or
мы
rather
не
wanted to beat Ukraine on the
хотели
hands,
бить Украину по
not to
рукам,
let it develop
для России
relations with someone other than the Russian
заводить
Federation.
отношения с кем-то помимо Российской
Not
Федерации.
at all.
Совсем нет. Мы просто
We
хотели,
just
чтобы
wanted the commitments that Ukraine had within the
обязательства,
framework of the CIS free trade
которые
area,
Украина имела в
within the
рамках
framework of
зоны
relations
свободной
with
торговли
Russia,
СНГ,
and which
в
brought
рамках
Ukraine
отношений с
significant
Россией,
fruits,
и
so that these
которые
obligations would not
приносили
suffer,
Украине
and that there would be no
существенные
contradictions
плоды,
between the
чтобы эти
principles that underlay
обязательства не
these relations,
пострадали, чтобы
and those principles that were
не было
laid down in the
противоречий
agreement
между
with the European
принципами,
Union.
которые лежали в основе этих отношений, и теми принципами, которые закладывались в соглашении с Евросоюзом.
And then President Putin turned to the head of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, the Portuguese former prime minister. And now we have a free trade zone with Ukraine. You want to do something similar with Ukraine, and the principles on which these two free trade zones are built, they contradict each other. Therefore, let's get together the three of Ukraine, Russia, and the European Commission, and figure out how to harmonize it. Well, it would seem that what is more reasonable. Barroso replied through some channels that the European Union does not interfere in Russia's trade with Canada for some reason, and you do not touch our relations with Ukraine. And now we are talking about Victoria Nuland, about how she admitted that $5 billion were invested in Ukraine in the years leading up to the coup. But the European Union was the stimulator of this crisis. It was the European Union that raised the maiden, and it was the European Union that threw in the slogan that Ukraine should be with Europe, not with Russia. They have directly stated this publicly. Therefore, please do not accuse us of anything here and try to justify your lawlessness with the actions that Russia has already taken absolutely forcibly, having exhausted all the reserves of its goodwill, its kind proposals, and so on. You also know several examples of the dishonesty of the European Union in the 29th, in my opinion, or the 10th year. The European Union had problems, first of all France. There were problems in Chad and in the Central African Republic. And there they had some, first of all, the French expeditionary forces were small. They lacked air support. We were asked to send a helicopter group there to assist in the fight against the rebels, who were engaged in genocide and other outrages. We sent this group, and then we said, guys, since we have such an experience with you, in my opinion, it's the 10th year or the 9th. Since we have such experience, let's create a mechanism for joint crisis response to situations abroad. And proposed an approach according to which they did not seem to refuse, they began to discuss. And we proposed an approach that said that if Russia conducts an operation, it can invite the European Union. If the European Union conducts operations, it can invite the Russian Federation to participate on a parity basis. It seemed that everything was going to come to an agreement, and then they told us no, there will be no parities. There is an agreement, it is called the agreement, on the possibility of Russia's participation in EU operations. That's it. Here's an approach based supposedly on equality. But there are quite a few other examples, including the so-called Messeburg Initiative, which we recently commented on. When Putin and Merkel agreed on a statement in Messeburg on the creation of a committee for foreign policy coordination, security coordination, Ukraine was not mentioned at all at that time. It would then have been mentioned in Transnistria. And Merkel really wanted us to condition the creation, so that the creation of such a committee was conditioned by the progress in the Transnistrian settlement. Recorded this position. Then, based on these agreements, we ensured the resumption of the work of the 5+2 mechanism on the Transnistrian settlement, which had not been going for several years. And he resumed his activities. But when we told the European Union, well, now we are creating a joint committee on foreign policy and security, they evaded the answer and the whole idea was buried. That's what the word is worth, even the signature of the European Union, but in this case, in the person of the Chancellor. Chancellor Merkel, and quite such a screaming example is the visa-free regime with the European Union. Negotiations have been conducted, in my opinion, since 2004 year. Earlier, because in the 2004 year at the Russia-EU summit, Roman Prodi said that in a couple of years, we would go on a visa-free regime. A couple of years passed, then a few more couple of years flashed by. We worked out our internal norms based on the framework that was agreed with the European Union. When we have completed these norms within the country, when we have agreed on bilateral agreements corresponding with each member of the European Union, there are no more conditions that would not be fulfilled. The European Union thought for a long time in response to our question, when will you cancel the visa regime, and then said, let's work out, we have a new document, a draft document, joint steps. Some very technical nuances were outlined there, but we nevertheless joined in this work. At that time, the President recalled these times more than once, well, not that even faith was alive. There was a glimmer of hope that we were dealing with decent people. As a result, these additional technical issues were also closed. It was the 13th year of summer, and when we said, well, let's announce it, they left official contacts on this topic. Firm an official response. And on the sidelines they whispered to us, you know everything, you are already completely ready. But for political reasons, we cannot give you visa-free earlier than Moldova and Georgia. Ukraine was not mentioned then. That's it. Therefore, if the European Union imputes something to us that we violated something there, first of all, there is not a single fact. And secondly, we have something to reassure our European colleagues.
And the final question, please, Merchant. Sergey Viktorovich, hello. The agreement on good neighborliness, friendship and cooperation between Russia and China expires next year. Are negotiations underway to extend it? Or will Moscow and Beijing work out a new agreement, taking into account the changed realities?
You know, this agreement, it fully retains its relevance. It is not by chance that when the first term of this agreement expired in the 21st year, President Putin and President Xi Jinping approved somewhere on the 16th of July, in my opinion. It was signed and entered into force in June 2000 of the 21st year, a month or so before its expiration. President Putin and President Xi signed a document extending the validity of this agreement for 5 years. These 5 years are now expiring. In that statement of the 21st year, it was said that the treaty fully retains its force, is fully relevant, and fully meets the interests of further building up the strategic partnership of third-party interaction between our countries. To be honest, I think that this assessment remains valid. But, of course, events are developing rapidly. Our strategic cooperation and multifaceted partnership with the People's Republic of China is deepening, taking on new and new dimensions. Therefore, we agreed in principle with colleagues from other departments to see if there is any specific direction that can be used to enrich this agreement.
Конкретное направление, которое может быть использовано для обогащения.
I do not know in what form it can be. This can be done by adopting another document that will confirm and develop the provisions of this agreement.
Подтверждать и развивать положение этого договора.
We do not have any clear solutions right now. They are not actually required.
Решений они, собственно, не требуются.
Because these decisions, when you put them on paper, they fix the situation in real life. In real life, we have a relationship that never happened. They are so advanced, dense, trusting, and, as our Chinese friends say, we work in all spheres of international life shoulder to shoulder. Back to back, these are not easy words, so I assure you, the date of July 16, 2026 year, will not go unnoticed, as specifically our interaction with the Chinese will be confirmed and developed and deepen friends. This will be handled by the administration of the two presidents and the chairman, and there will definitely be a report at the management level later.